This is Asad Hashim. I'm here with Professor Michael Hudson, who's with the Middle East Institute in Singapore. Professor Hudson, what do you think the outlook is for Egypt politically?
Well, it's a little bit hard to say at this point. I think immediately after the fall of Mubarak, there was a great deal of enthusiasm that civil society, led by the middle class and the young people mostly, would rise up and form an entirely different kind of government. But of course, there are still the remnants and the old structures that have not by any means really disappeared. So as far as I can tell, what you're looking at now is a new regime in formation. It seems to be dominated by the high military command. So much depends on how much change they are willing to support. The constitutional amendments that are being talked about are not enough, I think, for some of the protesters. And it's not likely, I think, for example, that Egypt would go, say, from a presidential system to a parliamentary system. And so as long as the office of the president remains strong, the possibilities for a renewal of authoritarianism of another kind are definitely there.
All right. Now, particularly in the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, do you think that the military is playing a role that's going to be inculcating democratic institutions, or is there a concern about, I should ask, about the military's role in this transition?
Well, the good news about the militaries in Tunisia and Egypt is that they stood aside and basically assisted in the fall of dictators or authoritarian rulers that had pretty clearly lost their legitimacy. And so the transitions, at least the collapse of those regimes, was fairly quick and fairly painless. And the military, in a sense, played a positive role. But at the same time, the military is there, and in both cases, the military is part of the economy. The military benefits a great deal from the political linkages that it had with the regime, and presumably the senior officers don't want to give up those perks. At the same time, in both cases, the officer corps seems to have been quite professional, and in that sense, it reminds you a little bit of the Turkish military, which has played, of course, a complicated role in Turkish politics, but more often than not, after intervening, it is pulled out. So in that sense, I think the role of the military in those two places has been fairly positive so far. But how far are the military establishments willing to go to allow genuine civilian rule and the full and significant participation of civil society, political parties, and so forth? At the moment, I think there is some room for guarded optimism in those cases. And when you compare the role of the military in Tunisia and Egypt with the role of the armed forces in Libya, or perhaps in Yemen, where the armed forces seem to be very much tied to a particular dictator, then you would think that the military in Tunisia and Egypt has not been so bad.
Right. Finally, a lot has been said about this being a sort of revolution or string of revolutions that's led by the Arab youth. Do you think that the youth are as actively involved in the discourse as they were in the actual uprising?
Well, I think that the youth are not really on top of the discourse yet. Excuse me, I'm afraid I'm fighting a cold. I think there's no doubt that the youth were instrumental in organizing and providing energy and enthusiasm that stimulated other sectors of society into these remarkable mass protests. And I think that in a sense, it's a youthful movement, and the youth account for the fact that the ripple effect from these protests that began in Tunisia and Egypt has spread all over the region. I don't think there's a single country in the Arab world that hasn't been affected one way or another. And it's pretty clear that the youth who are more technologically savvy and more into new media and social media are playing a role. But so far, at least, I am not aware that there are younger spokesmen, younger philosophers, younger people kind of laying out policy options and political programs. Take the meeting here, the Aljazeera forum here. Of course, it's only just begun, but it seems to me that the mean age of the participants, as you look around the room, is they're not so young. And it was interesting in this first session that finally at the end, a young person, a young woman, a young Egyptian woman who happened to be there was sort of, pointed out and allowed to say some words. I thought that was nice, but it also struck me that that was about the only youthful voice so far that we've heard. I guess what I'm saying is that the political discourse, the chattering classes, the thinkers, and so forth, so far seem to be, the ones that we're familiar with. These are people who are established, have reputations, have influence, and maybe we're just not aware of what is going on beneath the surface. But are there new parties? Are there new programs? Are there new ideologies coming from a younger generation? I don't think I have seen that yet.
Sure. Professor Hudson, thank you so much for your time.
Certainly.